I'm Jason Mefford, and I am with Brad Miller. And today we are going to talk about the power of silence, or maybe the sound of silence, too. So, welcome everybody. So, Brad, I know I love music, and before we started on this, you were playing the song "The Sound of Silence" from Simon and Garfunkel, which is one of my I wouldn't necessarily say favorite songs, but it is probably one of my favorite songs. And there's actually an interesting story behind it. I don't know if we'll get time to talk about that, but we're going to talk about silence, right? So this is a topic that you kind of thought to bring up. So Brad, why don't you kind of just jump in and let's see where this goes, talking about silence.
Yeah. So I was going to start this thing by saying we're going to talk today about the power of, and see if everybody got it. But
well, because a lot of people that are listening, they're like, hold it, what happened to the audio, right?
They probably figure there was some issue and like internet bugged out or something. And but yeah, so one reason, so we moved from the city the fall of 2020, and when we were looking for places, we wanted some place that would be away from all the hustle and bustle of the city. We wanted some place, schools were a big issue with our daughter. But for me, one of the important things, particularly because I work from home, is I wanted some place that was going to be quiet, some place that I didn't have to worry about, fire trucks racing by, or people screaming and yelling as they drive down the street in front of me. I wanted some place that was very peaceful and serene. And, if you asked me 10 years ago, I'd have said, who wants to be someplace there's no sound, whatever, but I've come to appreciate just the quiet time. And that's one of the things I love about where we live now, is that I get that quiet time. I get the silence. I can go out in the backyard, or I can actually just go on our back deck out here. And, outside of maybe sometimes a neighbor will drive by, you don't hear anything, it's silent. And that's one of the things that I really love, because nowadays in our modern world, it is very hard to find silence. We have technology everywhere. We've got social media trying to grab our attention. Everything that we do is kind of beeping and flashing at us and really trying to get us to pay attention to them. And it's really hard to find silence, and it's one of the benefits of, again, me being home by myself and working, is I can have that silence. Like when my daughter's home, there's no silence there. Like, a 7-year-old running through the house, not so much. And that's, and I know we'll talk a little bit about why silence is so important, but I first kind of, wanted to, mention the fact that it is really hard to find silence sometimes, because we're so engaged with things, and why sometimes you actually are going to have to go and take steps to find the solitude, the quiet yourself, because you may not be around a situation where you've got that.
Well, I think it's interesting because there's the external noises.
Yep.
And there's also the internal.
And right? That's the second part of it.
Yeah. And so it's interesting, because again, I mean, in our neighborhood, we have all the houses that are around, and pretty much everybody has gardeners that come in. So every single day, like right now, I can hear a leaf blower, right? Hopefully you can't hear that coming through on the recording, but I can hear that. That's an external noise, right? That is coming in. And if I choose to focus on that external noise, I kind of go a little crazy, right? Because it's like, and it's not a very pleasant frequency to listen to. But, there's the external, but there's also the internal. And so as you were talking, it kind of reminded me of an experience that I had. So I live kind of in the LA area, in a suburbia, kind of neighborhood, right? And it's really quiet here for the most part, but we are situated right between a military base and the Long Beach airport. And so a lot of times we will have, air traffic and other things that are going on. We're a mile and a half from the freeway. So sometimes if you're quiet, you can kind of hear a little bit of the freeway humming, and stuff like
Mhm.
that, right? But so there was this one day where I just felt like, I need to get to the mountains and I need to just have some peace and quiet. Oh, I like my goddamn peace and quiet, right? And so,
Got my yawn. Yeah.
yeah. And we're not very far away from the mountains. So I'm like, okay, it was either a Saturday or Sunday. I get up, at whatever time and decide that I'm going to drive up into the hills. It's only about an hour away. I can get up into the solitude of the mountains just outside of LA. So I get up, get in my car, and I go drive it, right? And I have kind of this place in my mind of where I'm going to kind of go. And so I start driving and I get up there, and guess what? The road is actually closed. I get going up there. I go to the closest place that I can get to, and the police have the road knocked off, right? And so I couldn't get up to where I wanted to. And so at first I'm kind of like, oh, that's kind of weird, because I was kind of envisioning myself going to this place and I can't get there. So I drive along the side of the hills until I can get to the next place. Because here in LA, there's only a few places where you can get up into the mountains. So I drive to the next place, and I'm driving up, and I get up there in the top, and I'm like, this is nice. This is going to be great. I find this little vista area to pull off on the side too. And there's like one or two other cars that are up there. There's a couple of people, but I've got this great view and everything seems so peaceful. And so I'm like, great, this is a good place to go. I go over, I sit on a rock, and I'm just kind of sitting there for a couple of minutes, like, this is nice. And all of a sudden, the ground starts shaking a little bit. Okay. And it's like, okay, this isn't an earthquake. And all of a sudden I look up and there's like this Asian biker gang. Not that they're a gang, but it's like probably 40 or 50 motorcycles come up. And so it's just like the noise, the rumbling of the ground, everything else. And they stop right where I'm at. Right. And so they all get off, and they even kind of block my car in, because they weren't really like looking where they were parking. And they were having some sort of I think it was some sort of a memory, kind of gathering for somebody who had passed away, because they had a big picture of this person and they were taking pictures and doing some other stuff. And so here I am, I'm like, fuck, I went all the way up into the mountains to get away from the noise, and I can't get away from the noise. So I get in the car, I drive for a little while. There wasn't really any good place for me to pull over. I finally find this area, and I'm like, oh, this is good. It looks like there's a little trail that goes back into the hills. This is going to be perfect. So I pull off to the side of the road, I get out, and I kind of start hiking back in there. And I maybe only get about 100 yards. And it's just like a little ravine that kind of ends in the side of the mountain, right? So it's only like 100 yards in. And so the highway is right there, but I walk in, and there's kind of like this little waterfall kind of thing going down, and I can hear the water, very tranquil, very nice. So I sit down, and I'm like, this is nice. And then all of a sudden, right? And so I can start to hear all of these cars that are going along the highway. And there wasn't a whole bunch of them, but again, you can, at that point on the highway, people are driving 50, 60 miles an hour. And so you hear the cars go by like that. And so I'm like, well, that's okay. I can sit here. When it goes by, I'll just kind of, you can do it. One of the things that I do is like, every sound I hear, the deeper I go, when I'm trying to meditate or relax myself, that even as I'm hearing noises, I'm just using those noises as a way to make myself go deeper and deeper. So I'm like, this is okay. And then a car pulls over, and I hear these teenage girls. I don't know how old they were, but they were somewhere between 16 and probably 22. Three girls get out of the car and they start coming in the path where I'm at. And they were like chatty, 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 kind of thing, right? And so here I am inside this little ravine and they're echoing like back and forth. And so it's like, right? And so anyway, so I get up, I leave, I'm like, fuck it, I'm going back home. So I just drive back home and sit in my backyard. And it's more quiet in my backyard from an external noise perspective than it was even when I went to the mountains, right? So why am I telling you all of this, right? The lesson that I got from it is, again, we don't have to go somewhere else to try to find the silence. And a lot of times the external noises have nothing to do with silence, right? Because there's a difference between no sound and silence as well, which is an interesting thing when you stop and start to kind of think about that a little bit more as well, right? So silence, right? I mean, maybe how are some of the ways that you get silent, Brad? How do you use it?
So one of the ways is I go hiking.
Mhm.
There's a couple of different spots I like just to kind of sit down. And like you said, it's still close enough to the highways and the roads that it's not void of sound.
Mhm.
So it's not that there's no sound. There is some sound around, but from the distance, it's more of just a very low humming sound. And so a lot of times I will still use the time, the space to kind of go into some meditation. At that point, I will put on like a meditation audio sometimes with my headphones. Kind of my AirPods kind of have noise canceling in them, so I can put something on and kind of drown out other things around me, even if it's, the kid in her room next to me, playing or whatever like that, the dog's going crazy. I can still kind of block some of that out and use that um to kind of let my mind go silent, go quiet that way.
Mhm. Well, and because like for me, I try to be in silence as much as I can during the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the things that's interesting too, is when we're talking about silence, it doesn't necessarily mean like you're a Buddhist monk, sitting down in complete absolute silence, going om kind of thing, right? But
Mm-hmm.
can we, when you're thinking about it, the external noises, the external silence, I think is easy enough for everybody to understand. But the
Right.
internal silence, again, I think is, and being able to connect to yourself, connect with the universe, connect with spirit, whatever you want to call it, is a little different. Because actually, sometimes when you try to get silent, all the monkey chatter and everything else comes out, and it's more noisy inside your mind than it is
Mm-hmm.
outside of you as
Right.
well.
Yeah, because then you hear all the chatter going on, where maybe
Mhm.
it was just kind of a low murmur in the background before everything else going on, but now you can really hear all those voices going on in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's it's one of those where if we can sit in silence a little bit each day, again, things can be going on all around us, but if we can sit in silence and slow our mind down, slow the monkey chatter down, and just try to tune or connect, because I think this is what's interesting too, is that the further I've gone along on the path, it's not silence is not absence of noise. It doesn't necessarily mean even absence of thought, but there is a sound to silence as well, right? And so again, going back to that, the sound of silence, Simon and Garfunkel, right? I mean, there's some great lines in that song as well, right? And I remember I listened to an interview with Paul Simon, and the person was like trying to find out all that. And like, so Paul, when you said this, what were you thinking? What does that line mean? And he's
Mm-hmm.
like, I wrote that in 1974 or whatever it was, and I don't really remember much of that year. So I have no idea what I meant by that line, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But that's one of those songs where there's a lot of deeper meaning in those things, and that there is a sound to silence as well, right? And so again,
Mhm.
it's like, the words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls, right? And that's one of those things where it's like, well, what does that mean? Well, I think we kind of talked about it in one of the other episodes before, right? But when you silence yourself, when you reduce all that monkey chatter that's going on in our mind, things that we see on the subway walls or things that we see maybe graffitied on the tenement halls can all of a sudden have a meaning to us.
Mhm.
It can connect us. It can be something that all of a sudden we're like, man, I've seen that sign so many times before, but now as I'm silent, that means something to me. And in this particular moment,
Mhm.
as I try to recapitulate on what it is, right? And I'm using that word instead of thinking, because there's a difference between thinking and recapitulating, right? And I think a lot of times when people sit down and think that they're trying to be silent, they're trying to think their way through something. And that's not what we're talking about,
Yeah.
right?
No.
But it also doesn't mean no thoughts as well, right? Because sometimes the seemingly random things that pop into your head when you're trying to be silent, or the random things that you might see when you're trying to be silent, have a meaning. But unless you're silent, you won't see those things.
Yeah, and that's why I think that when we talk about things like, mindfulness, I know
Mhm.
a lot of professionals, particularly, we kind of bristle at that because we's like, well, I've tried that before, but I just had all these thoughts in my head. Like I couldn't get my stop all the thoughts. And so they get frustrated because, their thinking is, and I was there too when I first started doing some meditation work, was that, there's just so much still going in my head. I can't get quiet. So I must not be doing it right. I don't know how do I get these voices to stop? I can't, what's wrong with me? And so it kind of gets frustrated, and then you kind of like, well, I just can't do this meditation stuff, it's not for me, and then they move on. But like you said, it's not necessarily that you're trying to stop the thinking, stop the thoughts in there, um but you're trying to focus a little bit more, and you're trying to pay attention to what's coming through. Maybe you're catching a pattern, something you've seen before, or something that now, in light of other circumstances, has a specific meaning to you.
Mhm. Well, and maybe I try to give an example here for people too, right? Because just be aware of the thoughts that are coming in. So let's say I'm sitting here and I kind of have a little process to where I've just trained myself with self hypnosis long enough that when I sit quiet, I just kind of, still my body in whatever
Mhm.
position, usually a sitting position. And I'll say to myself, deeper relaxed, deeper relaxed, deeper relaxed, deeper relaxed, right? Because that's the hook that I have used,
Your trigger, yeah.
my trigger to let my body know, I'm breathing slowly, I'm focusing on my breath, I'm saying that to myself. It's a way for me to slow down my brainwave activity and get into kind of that little bit of an altered or more quiet uh, state, right? Where I can be silent and I can be, receiving. And if you set the intention, that's what you want to do, or that maybe you're trying to receive guidance on something from the universe. When you go into a session like that, even if it's only a couple minutes, setting the intention will help you, right, to be able to do that. Now,
Mhm.
let's say again that I'm sitting here doing that. I'm sitting comfortably. I'm relaxing. I'm slowing down my brain. I'm tuning, trying to tune myself into spirit or the universe or whatever you want to call it. And all of a sudden, if a thought comes into my head like, "Oh, what are you going to have for dinner tonight?" No, that doesn't really matter. If you're having a thought like, what am I going to have for dinner? Oh, no, I think I left the laundry in the washing machine and I need to switch it, right? When those kind of thoughts come in, right, just move your attention back to and what I'll say to myself is I'll take care of that later and try to move my attention back to where I'm going. I'll take care of that later, move my attention back to where I want to be. But if I'm sitting there and all of a sudden a thought pops in my head, like, you should check in with Brad, then I'm like, huh, well, that was kind of random. That's like not a normal thing that would pop in. So it's something that's kind of random that comes into me at that time. And this does happen to me. And so what I would do is when I come out of that, I would send Brad a text. I'm like, hey, Brad, I was thinking of you. How you doing, man? Because that to me is something that is still a thought that comes in, but that's more listening to when those things that are kind of random come in. Those are the things to start to pay attention to.
Yeah.
When you're sitting there and you see that sign that you've seen 100 times before, but all of a sudden it's like, whoa, that could mean this. That's kind of different, right? And again, and a lot of those times we don't want to place judgment on it, right? Because that's again where some of the mindful stuff comes back. But what I'll say to myself is, oh, that's interesting. I start saying that to myself a lot. That's interesting. Right? Because I'm not trying to place judgment on it. I'm like, oh,
Sure.
that's interesting. I wonder what that means. Right. And then it's okay to maybe go down that path a little bit, right? Like you see something and you're like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what that means for me. And then you just kind of sit with it in the silence. You're not trying to think your way through it. You're not trying to figure it out. It's almost like, the universe sends you a little message. And so you have a clarifying question. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder what that could mean. And then you sit and wait. And then the universe will prompt you with something else, right? And the more that we're silent, the more that we ask the questions, the more that we try to recapitulate on it, the more the universe can communicate with us, because then we're tuning into and trying to get the answers, right? But that looks different, right, than what most of us as professionals are like. Oh, okay, I got to get out my piece of paper and my pen, and I got to start. Oh, let's see here. Well, what does that mean? And logically trying to think your way through it. Then you get out of that silence. You're not trying to logically work your way through it. You're just trying to, without judgment, maybe ask some additional questions and see what comes to you.
Yeah, and that's really hard for professionals, is to try to silence that logic, because we're taught logic. Like I know, as a lawyer at law school, that's all a law school is logical reasoning, analytical thinking. It's trying to break things down. It's all using, the modern part of your brain to try to work through problems and come up with answers and solutions. And so now we're telling people, you know what? Maybe you don't do that. Maybe you just kind of ignore that for a while and put that aside. And so I'm seeing I'm sure there's a lot of people who are like, what are you talking about? Like, that logic's what I do. Like, that's how I come up with how I make my money. That's my day job, is be thinking and to logical reason stuff. And, but this is something that you have to do differently. Logic and all that stuff, reasoning has its place. But when it comes to tuning in to, for lack of a better term, I'll just say things outside of your thinking, your thoughts, outside of your immediate knowledge, which I know is not a very good way to explain it, but it'll deal for the present, I guess. That's what you have to do, is you kind of have to suspend that logic. Kind of push it aside, like you said, times like, I'll take care of all that logical stuff later. Instead of just kind of listen, just kind of focusing, asking the questions.
Well, and one thing that I learned that maybe will be helpful for people too is, if you think about, and it's not just in these three areas, but think of it as three different things: your head, your heart, and your gut, right? Your head, your heart, and your gut. is that, most of the times the way the universe speaks to us is not in logical thought, right? Because logical thought is very limited. And so most of the answers are going to come as feelings or knowings or other things like that, which usually we feel in our heart, we feel in our gut, or we feel in other parts of our body, right? And so the problem is you can't logically think your way to understanding a feeling, right? Because now all of a sudden you get into a different space, right? And again, I mean, CPAs, my risk management, my professional background too is also very logical, right? But if you sit there and one example I try to share with people is, and I did this. Okay, so this is y'all can make fun of Jason for this, but it's like in a relationship, right? Like feeling or knowing that you love somebody. But can you logically describe that? Can you logically pull out your pen and paper? And I did this one time. I'm like, I don't know. Do I love this person? I don't know. Let me think about this, right? Let me think
Pros and
about it.
cons would make a,
Pros and
yeah.
cons. Let me think about this, right? But it's like I can never think my way to understanding a feeling. The feeling just is, right? Or the same thing, like, right now in my life, I'm receiving certain feelings or knowings about what I need to do, a path that I need to go down. Now, I could sit there and I could try to, again, logically, doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. But I feel it. When I sit in the silence, I know that's what I'm supposed to do, right? So if you want to just try to push the feeling out, effectively what you're saying is, screw you, universe. You're telling me to do something, but I can't logically think my way to it. So screw you, right?
Right.
And if
Doesn't exist. You don't. Yeah.
yeah, and so if you're doing that, right, like we've talked about before, right? Universe or spirit will come to you and they're like, hey, Brad, you need to do this. Hey, Brad. Hey, Brad. Right? But if you're not listening, if you're not holding the silence, right? It would be like if you and I are talking, right? We'll try to put this in a 3D for people to understand, right? If we're having a conversation, but every time you start talking, I interject and I don't let you finish saying what you're saying. I keep interrupting you. I keep
I wonder
placing
what that's
some
like.
some
Yeah, I don't know.
yeah, what's up like, right? Shut up, Jason, shut up. I keep throwing questions at you. I keep telling you, well, Brad, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, oh, I know, Brad, but that doesn't make any sense. If I do that for a little while, are you going to keep talking to me?
Hell
No.
no. Screw
Uh-uh.
you. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I'm that way too. Sometimes people will ask me a question and I'll start to try to answer them and they keep interjecting and they've got the monkey chatter going on and they're all stuck in their head. And so I just stop. I just stop. Right. It's like, well, you're not ready to listen. So I'm going to quit talking. And spirit and the universe does the same thing. If we're not sitting in silence, if we're not allowing it to speak to us, if we're not hearing what is being spoken to us, right? And I'm just saying that because that's like language that we can kind of understand, even though it's not an audible voice that you're going to be hearing probably. But if we're not holding the silence and letting the universe share with us what it wants to, then it's going to quit talking. Just like we would quit talking if somebody keeps interrupting us and doesn't sit in silence and listen when we're trying to speak.
It's just like Luke Skywalker who has decided to shut himself off from the Force.
Mhm.
And the Force says, all right, well, screw you, Luke, then you're on your own.
And that's a great, see, that's one of those little breadcrumbs. I love Star Wars for that reason. It's, science fiction, blah, 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 blah. No.
It's not science fiction, it is
So,
fantasy.
fantasy, well, okay. But it's science faction to me as well. But it's what's interesting is, again, that it's another way for us, and there's an example, right? When you watch Star Wars, you are receiving messages
Mhm.
from the universe. Some people watch those movies and they don't ever really think about a lot of the deeper meanings that are in that movie. But as you sit in silence, as you recapitulate, as you think about some of those things, it's very, very deep and can be a very spiritual thing to listen to. The
Oh
whole
yeah,
idea
yeah.
with the Force, and like you said, Luke trying to shut off the Force. Well, okay. Good luck on your own, Luke.
Sit on the island with your little birds. Like that's
Yeah, well, or even like, the first A New Hope, when he's flying down the Death Star, right? Trying to
Mhm.
drop the bomb in the little hole. And he at first was just trying to rely on the guidance system, the technology on the fighter to drop it, right? And so he tries that, and dang, he misses, right? Because, I mean, again, think about this. The first run through, he's kind of trying to do it logically in the 3D with the tools that he's been given. And doggone it, he misses. And so he turns around and he comes back and he starts to quiet himself. And when he quiets himself, he hears Obi-Wan Kenobi's voice that says, trust the Force, right? And so he calms himself down. He pushes aside his logic, he pushes aside his guidance system.
literally
And
in this case, he actually pushed it.
literally, he pushes it away. So
Yeah.
it's great figuratively too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he just feels into it, and he knows when to push the button. And when he's silent and he just trusts, he knows when to push the button. And that's what we've been talking about. That's a great analogy for what we've been
Yep.
talking about. Push aside your logic, push aside your guidance systems, push aside a lot of the things that you've been taught about how the world is and how you have to do everything, and just trust the Force and sit in silence, have that knowing of how you need to do it, and then just rely on it.
Yeah. Yeah. George, I know George Lucas put he had a lot of kind of Buddhist philosophies and things like that in there, and a lot of stuff. If you really listen to it, like the scene, for instance, you can pull out a lot of good little nuggets there.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you talked about that you mentioned was the idea of self hypnosis as a way to kind of help you get down and quiet your mind. What is that, and what does that look like for you, and how is that something that maybe could help someone else to kind of get into this state where we're a little bit more focused on these feelings and away from our thoughts?
Yeah. So that's a whole nother episode too, right? But we'll try to give everybody a little bit of a hint here. So
In 2.5 minutes, go.
in 2.5 minutes, go. So in our brain actually fires off at certain hertz frequencies. And so most of our waking day, we're in what's called beta wave activity, which is a certain frequency. I think it's usually like 14 or 15, maybe. I don't remember the exact numbers, but the way I usually explain to people is, the higher the frequency, the faster.
Mhm.
And so in order to usually be still or quiet, we have to quiet our brainwave activity down. And so self-hypnosis or hypnosis is a way to slow down from beta down into alpha or theta brainwave activity, where we're more receptive to suggestion. We're more, most of the time when people talk about it, it's going into your subconscious mind, but it's even more than that. It's actually, that's the phase when you are more silent and able to receive messages from the universe. And so what I've done is I've just practiced enough that when I give myself the trigger or the anchor of deeper relax, deeper relax, deeper relax, I have trained my body, I have trained my brain that when I start breathing this way and I say these things to myself, okay, brain, it's time to quit thinking the monkey chatter and it's time to slow down so you can receive. And so when you think about it, and, a lot of people in our, kind of backgrounds, I'm going to do this. So your brain most of the day is like, right? And what you want to do is you want to slow it down, going from right. When you move yourself down, then you're actually able to be much more perceptive as to what's going on around you. And you've quieted that monkey chatter that's usually in our heads, right? Because especially like when we're in high beta activity, we're feeling emotions like anxiety. Well, if you're in that state, it's hard to receive anything other than whatever it is that is right in front of you. And so that's part of it, right? And it's some people from a spiritual practice perspective, that's why they meditate. That's why they breathe certain ways. That's why they'll use some of these different modalities to try to slow down their brain, tune themselves more to be able to receive some of the messages. And like I said,
Sounds, music, things like that.
Listening to music, I use music sometimes that way as well. So there's lots of different ways that you can kind of get there, but effectively you're just trying to slow down your brain, tune more to the frequencies where you can actually receive these messages and get into that silent state.
Now,
And
for the busy professional who's saying, how do I have time to do all this stuff?
You can do it in a minute or two. And even again, just doing some of these things for a minute or two will have a huge difference in your day and in your emotional state. I mean, even breathing, I've used a lot of breathing exercises myself. Knowing how to do some different breathing activities and doing it for like 90 seconds totally changes your emotional state. And so, yeah, a lot of busy professionals say, I don't have time for that. Yeah, I totally understand. You don't have time to sit down and meditate for 2 hours. I get it. Most days I don't have time to sit down and meditate for 2 hours. But I do have time for a minute or two to quiet my mind, to move my attention so that I can get back into the space where I want to be. And anybody can do that.
And there's a great quote that I've heard that that there's a guy who goes to like some sort of a guru or whatever and says, I don't have time to meditate for 5 minutes. What do I do? And the guru, the teacher says, well, that's why you need to be meditating for 10 minutes. Because you're just going crazy. You need that extra time to quiet it down. So, but like I said, even 2 minutes.
Yeah. And the more that you do it, right? I mean, I've been doing this for years now, right? So for me, it doesn't take me very long to get into that state. If you're just starting, then maybe it's going to take you a little bit longer until you practice it a little bit more. But the more you practice it, and even if you only practice it for a minute at a time, but if you do a minute a day, it's going to get easier. right? Just like if I were to get down and do push-ups for 10 seconds, right? If all I can do is 10 seconds of push-ups, well, it makes 20 or 30 seconds or a minute easier if I'm even just doing the 10 seconds a day, right? Because we've got to work ourselves up to it as well.
Yeah, totally. So the silence, the messages I'm getting is that it's probably time to kind of wrap this thing up.
Was that what that silent pause was for?
I think, yeah, it's the messages coming to me.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add to this discussion here before we turn off Simon and Garfunkel? And
No, I think it's good. I mean, I think it's this is probably one of the key practices for everybody to be able to learn is however you can get there, the more you can be in silence during the day, even if it's only for 10 seconds or a minute at a time, the more you can spend in that space, the more peace you will feel, the more open and receptive you will be to hearing spirit or the universe. And you just feel calm, you'll feel happy, you'll feel this peace, right? And again, even if it's only for a minute, if all you can do is a minute, that's beautiful, right? Because every little step that we can take helps us. And so don't, again, it's like, that's why as we're talking about a lot of this stuff, we're trying to be practical. I mean, you and I have businesses we have to run too. It's not like we're Buddhist monks in Tibet that are just sitting around meditating all day. We've got lives. You've got a wife and kids, I mean, we've got lives, right?
yeah,
But every little bit that we can take is a step towards where we need to go. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes as well. And there really is power in silence.
yeah. And even if you don't hear the voices at the beginning, the peace of mind, the tranquility, like I said, even that is beneficial and worth doing it for.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening. Hopefully this all has inspired you to take some time in silence, to quiet your mind down a little bit, and hopefully it'll help. Like I said, we try to be practical on these discussions. Again, realizing that, most people don't have, like you said, the 2, 3, whatever hours a day to sit there, but even just a couple minutes a day, I think, like you said, this is something that's very powerful and has a lot of impact on your spiritual journey.
Well, because I know I've seen the impact of it in my life. And the more I do it, the more I feel it. And I know you're kind of that way too. That, even just these little things can make a huge difference. So there we go.
Awesome. All right.
Cool.
Thank you guys for listening, and we will catch you on the next episode.
Thanks, everybody.